Hi and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to Christine Sews a Lot. Today I'm going to do a sew along of Children's Corner's Romper, the Taylor pattern. You will notice that this pattern has a couple of options. You can make it with a ruffle, or you can make it without a ruffle. Now, I always make it without a ruffle, no matter whether I'm sewing it for a boy or for a girl, and for a couple reasons. One, I only have to trace and cut out one pattern per size, and I have made one of these in every size. I've made multiple in every size. And also, if I do it in a gender-neutral pattern, I usually sew with high-quality cotton fabrics, and this romper can be passed down through several children. So this is one of my favorites. It's very easy, very quick to sew. So come join me and let's get sewing. I'm not going to be able to get everything into this shot, but I want to make sure we have the important things included. One of the things I love about the Taylor pattern is it uses very little fabric. I can get all of the sizes. It goes from 3 months to 24 months. I can get it out of 2/3 of a yard of the main fabric and 2/3 of a yard out of the lining fabric. There are only 2 pieces, which are cut on the fold. You'll notice I have traced out my sizes. Like I said earlier, I have made this many, many times. And I want to show you a few tips for cutting it out and making quick work of it. Here's a tip that I learned early in my sewing journey from heirloom sewing. And that's for lining up your fabric, getting it on the grain nicely. So what I'm going to do is I am going to make a snip in my fabric and rip it. I'm not sure whether I've got an even edge on top, and this will give me an even edge. And it looks like I've already made something out of this because it appears to be a pretty even strip. So to make it easier to manage, I am going to break this down because, make sure I go with the right end here, the one that I just tore. So I want to get it to a more manageable size. I know I can get this out of 2/3 of a yard. And I know I've got an even edge here, so I'm just going to make a little snip here and tear the fabric. I've got a nice even edge on both ends. So I want to be efficient with how I use this fabric. I'm going to turn each side in. And to find the grain, as long as it's a decent quality fabric, all I need to do is line up my even edges. Now this has worked well for me in the past. If you know differently, please enter in the comments below. But I've got an even edge here, even edge here. I'd fuss with that just a little bit, but it doesn't take a lot to get it even. It does need a little bit of an iron, but to demonstrate it, I just line up the fold, pattern on the fold, one on one side, one on the other side. Your back side is going to be longer. And you see, even with 2/3 of a yard, I've got a little extra here. I have my pattern all laid out. I've used hair clips to attach and secure my pattern at the fold, and I'm using galvanized steel washers as pattern weights. I'm going to quickly cut this out with a rotary cutter, and I will say using the rotary cutter, cutting mat, and the pattern weights has really streamlined the sewing process for me. For years I cut with scissors, but now I'm on Team Rotary. I'll be back with you in a moment. I have my pieces cut out. It's only 4 pieces, 2 of the main fabric, 2 of the lining fabric, a front and a back piece. That's what makes this romper so easy to sew. You'll notice looking at your pattern that your back piece has longer straps than the front piece. I always put this together in the same order to save confusion and mistakes, especially if I'm doing late night sewing. With my main fabric, I take my back piece and I put my front piece on top because I'm going to be sewing right sides together along this side seam, and I match it up on the right. So I've got the front piece on top, the back piece on the bottom, and I'm going to pin this along the side. Let's do a quick pin. Our next step is we're going to be sewing this seam at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. We will be doing it for the main and for the lining. Front on top of back. For the lining, I do it opposite. I put the back piece on top, this is the one with the longest straps, and the front piece on the bottom, and I pin along the right side. The reason for this is after we sew the side seams together, we are going to be sewing the lining to the main fabric, right sides together, and you need to have it match up so that you're sewing the back to the back and the front to the front. It's a good idea to double check before you sew. After you've pinned the pieces, open it up and make sure that you sewed the correct side in order to have them right sides together and have front and back. So I'm going to go sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance, press it open, and I'll meet you back here. I have sewn down the sides of the front and back pieces of this Taylor Romper, and now I'm going to pin the main fabric and the lining fabric together. I'm going to pin around the top, the armhole, the top, and the bottom. I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to try to stay out of the shot here, or not to block the camera. So let me line these up. And while I'm lining these up, it's a good time to talk about some sewing fundamentals that will make the world of difference in how your garments come out. So 2 things that I want to mention that I'm thinking of right now is how carefully you cut out your pattern pieces. It's really important to try to be as precise as possible so that you can get a good match. If you can see how nicely this is lining up, it's because I really was careful when I was cutting out my pattern pieces. So I will line these up better, but I wanted to show you where I'm going to be pinning. I'm going to be starting here. I'm going to pin all along the top and the sleeve and neck openings. I'm not going to pin the sides, and then I'm going to pin along the bottom, all along the bottom. So careful cutting and careful seam allowances. Had I used different seam allowances or not been as careful and sewing up this seam, then again, I would not have had a good match. So those are two things that are very basic, very simple, that will make a world of difference in how your garment turns out. So I'm going to pin along, and I'll come back when I have all of this pinned so I can show you what it looks like. I am pinned together, as you can see, all along the top and along the bottom. I like to use glass head pins. Here's a close-up of them, because you can iron over them and not melt the pin head. These are some fine pins, so they're sharp, very nice pins. I think they're worth the little bit extra money. I do use clips at times, the Wonder Clips, but I find on some garment sewing, especially when you're working on smaller garments, that I prefer to pin, and it's actually faster and more precise for me to be pinning than to use the clips. Because sometimes I find that when you have a lot of clips in, if you're pulling the clip in as you're moving, it can sometimes pull the fabric, and maybe you will get off on your guide for your seam allowance. So the next step is I'm going to sew along the top and the bottom at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'll be right back. I have sewn along the top and the bottom at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and the next step is going to be doing a little trimming. Just like anything that you're going to be turning, you want to trim your corners. I have already trimmed these corners. You want to trim close to the stitching line, but not into the stitching line. You also are going to want to clip the curves. So trimming the corners, see if I can do this while holding it up. You just want to snip off the corners. Again, you don't want to clip those threads. And also just trim some of the bulk away from the seam line. I'll do this corner, clip, clip, and then trim some of the bulk away. For these curved areas, you have a choice where you could go in and clip into the curve like this. Careful not to clip into the stitching line. So you can clip little snips into the curved lines with your scissors, being careful not to clip your stitching, or you can use pinking shears, which have these notches and will leave notches. I'm going to cut the bottom with the pinking shears and show you what that looks like. Okay, so I have used my pinking shears around the curves. I've clipped my corners. And our next step is we are going to turn it right side out and iron it well. Poke out the corners. And I'll come back here and I'm going to tell you why I did that step in a moment. To turn it right side out, I'm just going to reach through the sides. Remember, we did not sew those together. Pull it through. And then I'm going to take my time pushing out the strappy areas, and I'll use something to poke them out, the purple fang or chopstick, whatever I have handy. point turner, and I'm going to iron this well, and I'll be back in a moment. I have ironed my garment. I poked the corners out, and I took my time to make sure that I had a nice finish. Used lots of steam, and I've got nice crisp corners and nice edges. This is a really important step because now is the time when you can easily get in and make these finished edges look nice and get very precise corners. The next step is to turn it back inside out. What I do is I reach through the garment on the sides. Remember, we did not sew the sides closed. And I will note that this is where I deviate from the pattern instructions. I find this as a quick, easy method. I was familiar with this from using other patterns, and it works for me. I reach through to turn it inside out and grab the other side, but I'm not going to poke out the areas that I took the time to make a really crisp edge, like the straps. So I've got this inside out, and I'm going to reach through again. I'm reaching through the side. Make sure you can see that. I'm reaching through the side opening. I'm grabbing the other side in my hand, and I'm pulling the other side to meet the side where I entered with my arm. And I am going to match up my side seams, and this is how I'm going to close and get a really nice finish where all the seams are enclosed, which is comfortable for the child, and also it makes it super quick and super easy. So I'm going to match these up, and I'm going to pin them, and I will be right back with you. I have pinned together all the way around the side opening. I started matching at the sides, and its lining is pinned to lining and main fabric is pinned to main fabric. I am going to leave an opening large enough to turn the garment out right side out, and you want to leave that opening in the lining side. I like to leave my opening about 3 or 4 inches, not at the very bottom of the garment, because this is where your elastic is going to go, but close to it, because it makes it a little easier when you're feeding the elastic through the leg opening, the casing and the leg opening that we're going to make. So I have several ways of marking where I'm going to leave the opening, and I'm demonstrating a couple of them here. I don't usually use them all together. Sometimes I'll do an X, which reminds me, stop, don't go, don't sew. Or I might use large pins that are different from my other pins to mark where I want to leave an opening. And if I don't have those handy, I'll do 2 pins right next to each other. And when I see the double pin mark, I know, okay, stop, not going to sew that area. So I'm going to start sewing here. I'm going to go I'll start and I'll back stitch, and I'm going to go all the way around till I meet this pin, and I'll be sure to back stitch, and I'll do a couple of stitches so that I have a very strong opening where I'm going to be turning the garment through. So I'm going to go back to my sewing machine. I'm going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting here, back tack, go all the way around to here, back tack again, and this will be my opening, and I will turn the garment right side out. So I will meet you back in just a moment. I have it all sewn around. I have left my opening in the lining, and now it's time to turn it out. I'm going to turn it right side out. I'm just going to reach in and I'm going to pull the garment through the opening. And I don't mind leaving a bigger opening like that. It just makes it easier to pull it out. And I tend to just sew the opening closed with my sewing machine, so it's not like I'm trying to save myself stitches and doing a slip stitch or a ladder stitch, however you know it. So it's the inside of the garment. See, my straps still look really nice. That's why we took the time to press it, even though we were going to turn it right back inside out. Ta-da! There we go. Look at that. When you look on the inside of the garment, we just have this opening that will close up at the very end of our sewing time. So the next step is to make the casing. I will give it a quick press beforehand just to keep things nice and neat. I think ironing is a very important step in sewing, and if you don't skip it, you will find that your garments turn out much nicer. So for marking the opening, let me show you what I do for the casing. Marking the casing. The casing is sewn at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So the quickest way to mark the casing is to take your pattern piece, and I've marked the casing on this particular pattern piece, and I just look at where the end is and I pop a pin in on this side. I flip my pattern piece over. I've got the opening that I want to leave is right there, and I'll pop a pin in there. Put my 2 pins in. I flip it over. I take my back piece, line it up. That's where the casing's going to end. Just pop the pin in there. Flip the pattern over, and I'm going to pop the pin in where that ends. This way you'll have it nice and symmetrical when you do your casing. So I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance, starting here to this end. I'll start and end at the pins, and I'll back tack. I am not going to close this because that's where I'm going to feed the elastic through. I'll have one piece that'll go this way. I'll be doing the same on this side. I'll be sewing a casing at 1/2 inch from this pin to this pin, and I'll use my stitch plate seam guide to keep a nice even seam, and back tack at the beginning and the end so that it's nice and secure. And this is why we left this open, not only for turning, but so that we can go in and feed our elastic through. I use a bodkin to do that, but I'll show you in a moment. So the next step, I'm going to give it a quick little press, and I'm going to sew that 1/2 inch seam allowance to make my casing. And I think that was out of the shot, so let me show you again. 1/2 inch seam allowance to make the casing. I'm not going to close it off on the ends because that's where I'm going to feed through the elastic. And I'll be right back. I sewed the leg casings in, and because I used red thread, it's hard to see here, but you can see it much easier on the lining, as I also used red thread in the bobbing for demonstration purposes. And it looks fine. This is a baby romper. When I typically make these, I would match my bobbin thread to the lining, and when I go to close up the side and to do the buttonholes and the button, I will switch to white thread. But here you can see how I sewed the leg casing. I did not close it off on the ends, and this is just the right and left leg casing. I've measured out my elastic for the size 18 month. It is 7 inches. I need an elastic for the right leg and one for the left leg. And I'm going to use a bodkin to insert them. This is, you pull back that metal slider. You clip this on the end, push this down to secure it, and I will feed this through the casing. I'll find the hole that I left in the garment, and I'll insert this through the leg casing. On the other end of the elastic, I'll have one end with the bodkin. I will clip one of these on the other end so that I don't lose it through the garment. So I'm going to do that next, and I will be right back. So you can see what I'm going to do. I have my bodkin, the elastic, and this little piece has the clip on it, or sometimes I'll use a safety pin so that I don't lose this inside the casing and have to start over again. Typically when I get to the end, I will pin it in place as I feed the rest through, but I'll go in the opening and I will fish it around this way into the casing and then scooch it through. So I will be back and show you what this looks like. I fed the elastic through this hole. I went on this side. My bodkin is still inside the garment. I will pull this all the way out to the end. I have already pinned the end. Here's my clip that's attached to the other end of the garment. I will pull this, see the bodkin's inside. I will pull it clear like this, and I will sew the casing closed on this end. I will sew the casing closed on this end. Then I will remove the bodkin. I'll go in through this opening, pull out the bodkin, pull out the clip, and then I will do the other side. And that is what's going to give me my little elastic leg casing. Very quick, very easy, especially with the bodkin. You could use a safety pin on each end. That would also work well, but I find that this bodkin just makes it that much quicker and easier. So I'm going to sew close my casings on both leg openings, and I will meet you back here. It is really starting to look like an outfit, and now it's time to choose buttons. You can choose a button that blends in with your outfit, like these red buttons that would blend in. I am going to do the buttonholes in red, or you can choose to pick out a color that will pop and be an interesting detail on the fabric, and that's usually what I do. So I'm deciding between this blue and this yellow. I really like the blue, but I think it's a little large for the fabric. I think the yellow is more in proportion, so that's the one that I'm going to go with. In marking your placement, the buttonholes are going to go on the front of the outfit. The button will be sewn to the back. So the front will be on top, like this, with the back underneath. The pattern placement has the top of the buttonhole 1/4 of an inch from the finished edge. So I've gone in and I have marked with my Choco where the top of the button would be. And typically from there I just take the button and place it where I think it looks good in the center. And then I take the Choco, I line this up, and I just run the line underneath. Same on this side. I line the button up, I go underneath, and the actual buttonhole will go this way. So that's going to be my next step. I'm going to sew the buttonhole. I'm going to sew it with red in the top, white in the bobbin. After I do the buttonhole, I'm going to put a little fray check on it, and I'll show you that step. Let it dry, and I will use my buttonhole knife to cut the opening, and that'll give me a very nice and neat buttonhole without a lot of fraying. A tip I have for you for when you're sewing the buttonhole is to take some tissue paper. You can use some of the excess tissue from your pattern when you're cutting it out, or this is some tracing paper that I have some scraps left over, and I don't like to waste this since this is perfect for buttonholes or if I'm sewing something and I don't want the fabric to be pushed down in the throat plate. Is I'll cut it into a usable size. I'll put it behind the garment when I sew, and I'm going to get a nice neat buttonhole, and then I can just tear it off when I'm done. So I'm going to go to my sewing machine, I'm going to sew my buttonhole, and I'll be back. It's always a good idea to test your buttonhole on a scrap of the same fabric that you're using before you put it on your outfit, just to make sure you get the size right. So I've set up my machine. I've got my automatic buttonholer on. I measured my button. You can either look at your package or you can measure it. And this is a 22mm button. So I'm going to go to my buttonhole setting, and I'm going to select my buttonhole of choice. Now, I know that sometimes, just from experience, if I go with the exact measurement, it's going to be a tight fit. So on my practice one, I am going to select a 23mm button. So there we go. I have it set up. I've got it on the mark properly. Got my tail thread, and I'm going to try to do this without knocking into the tripod. Here we go. Speed it up a little bit. You notice I have the tissue paper underneath. This really helps the stitches, especially the satin stitch, to lay really nicely. So it's not just for keeping fabric from going into the throat plate, it also helps to have a good look. Coming to the end, I do love my automatic buttonhole foot on my Husqvarna. There we go. I'm going to raise it up. It has an automatic thread cutter. I'm just going to kind of hold it up see what it looks like. Now I'm going to use my buttonhole knife and I'm going to cut this open and test out my button, see if I like the fit. This is what it looks like on the back. Make sure I'm getting it in the frame. See how easily it just tears off, just like that. So I'll get my buttonhole knife, I'll cut it out, cut out the center, and then test my fit. Okay, I have my buttonhole knife. It's a little block of wood. You can see has been very well used. And I put the fabric with the buttonhole on top, and I take the buttonhole knife. I don't know if you can see this, but I'm just putting it very vertical here in the buttonhole, and I'm just going to wiggle it back and forth so that I don't cut my stitches. I really like this particular buttonhole knife. I have tried another one that I just didn't like as well. I found that I was cutting into my stitches. I do use fray check when I'm doing it on the garment. This is just a test, so I'm not being too careful here. I just want to see if I've got the right size. So there you go. Now, even if I didn't use fray check, this with washing would go away, the unraveling, because I didn't clip into my stitches. So I'm just going to take the button, push it through. It goes through easily, and I think I am going to go with the 23. The 22 might have worked, but I'm keeping in mind that we're going to have a mother dressing a wiggly wriggly 18-month-old in this outfit, and so I don't want there to be a struggle with the button. It's not gonna fall through the buttonhole, so I'm gonna go with 23 millimeters. So I'm gonna get that set up. I'm gonna sew my buttonholes on the front tabs, and after I do that, I'm going to put some fray check right in here and on the back side. I'm going to let it dry for about 10 minutes, and the fray check will do exactly what it says. It's going to keep this fraying and unraveling from happening and give me a nice clean opening. There'll be a little stiffness, but this is going to be on top, so the back strap will be underneath, so I don't have to worry about that irritating a baby's skin. So let me do that and I'll be back with you. A lot of people are afraid of buttonholes, but really they're not that difficult, especially if you have a good machine. Turn my machine on. So I've got my buttonhole complete. I did the fray check, I cut it open, I tested that my button would fit in the buttonhole and not be difficult for the mom or dad to button this in. Excuse my startup song. So the next thing is the button placement, and I simply just take my front and back tabs, line them up, and stick a pin in the top, and I use my thumb to feel where it is, as well as just holding it up and does it look even. I know that's not the most scientific way of doing this, but it has worked for me for several years. I think also the reason I'm not afraid to do buttonholes is I've done so many, and I started doing them pretty early in my sewing. So I didn't know any better. I didn't know that I should be nervous about doing them. All right, so I've got that lined up. I'm feeling with my thumb. That is it feeling about the same amount of fabric on the top and the back. I'm pinning it. Then I'm going to hold it up, which you can't see in the full view here, and I'm looking, does that look even? Does that look like the neckline is looking like it should? And it does. So the next thing I do is I just go to the center of the buttonhole. And again, this is not the most precise way. And this is a washable marker. It's actually Crayola brand that kids use, and it works fine and it comes out. And if it didn't come out, I wouldn't be super concerned because I'm going to cover it with the button. So I'm just going to make a little dot. Of course, I got some on the thread, so I have tested this and it does come out. I just make a little dot, and that's where I'm going to place my button. I'm going to pull the pins out and look and see. Now this one looks like it's a little bit over, but when I lined it up against this, I was very happy with the placement. So even though this isn't in the center, I'm still going to put the button there because it'll make the straps fit nice and correctly. So on my machine, I have a button setting that I can press. If I did not, and did you hear that noise? It was the feed dogs dropping. If I did not have that setting, I would turn whatever switch I had on my machine to drop the feed dogs and just do a zigzag stitch to attach this button by machine. Oh, sorry about that. I am sewing with the tripod between my knees. So all I do is I'm going to line this up. I'm going to put my button down. And I know from experience that I want the zigzag to be wider than the setting. And most of the buttons that I use in children's clothing, the two buttonholes are the same distance apart, no matter the size of the buttons, unless you get to the real tiny ones. But I'm not using really tiny ones on children's clothing. So something I discovered was that if I lowered the needle down into the buttonhole and then lowered the presser foot, I don't have the button shifting, which can happen, especially when you have a ridge on this button. So I'm just going to crank this by hand to make sure I have the setting right. I have it on 4 millimeters. And let's see. That seems to be good. So if you don't have the buttonhole setting, you can zigzag this, but I'm going to go ahead and use this. Now I noticed it didn't quite catch the first time through, so I'm going to go ahead and do a second one. Just to make sure it's secure. So I'm going through the cycle twice and cut it. My button's attached. I'm going to trim the thread, and I like to tug on it a little bit. It's a little difficult to do one-handed, but I'll tug on it a little bit and snip it, and then the thread will go kind of below the button. So I'll do that off camera. I've got one button sewn, and I'll do the other one, and I'll be right back with you. I have my buttons attached, and you'll notice I used yellow thread to sew the buttons on. I just think that it looks nice when it just matches the button. Then the thread isn't standing out, and it's letting this yellow be the star of the button tab. All I have left to do is to close the opening that I had in the romper, attach the snaps, and then we're finished. So for the opening, I've already switched my sewing machine thread over to white, and I'll just turn this under And I'll probably give it a little press with an iron and not use pins, and just sew it closed. That's on the inside of the romper, so I just don't feel the need to try to hide the stitch by doing a slip stitch. I'm just going to sew that closed. I'm going to sew it closed, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to attach Kam Snaps. I have closed the lining, and now I'm going to show you how to insert Kam Snaps. I use this handheld tool. I also have a table press, but I want to show you on what most people have if they're using Kam Snaps. I've read several reviews before I purchased mine, and it seemed like most of the people who were making diapers had a strong preference for the Kam Snaps. And that speaks to durability, since the diaper covers are being washed again and again and again and again and get a lot of use. So I decided to go with Kam Snaps. I've been very happy with it, and it's not terribly expensive. So what I do is, again, this is not as precise as some people may do. Same with my straps, is I feel the top and the bottom, my front and my back piece, to see if my overlap is even. Even if I get it not so precise, if it looks good on the outside and looks good from the leg opening standpoint, I'm just going to go with it. Normally I will put pins in, but I took the pins to the sewing room, so I'm just going to use what I have here, and that's clips. So I would typically just kind of pin it in place. Use these clips just to kind of hold it in place. Again, I'm going to double check. Does it feel, as I feel through, does it feel like it's straight? Feels like it's a little bit off. I might do a little peek. And get this going. So in your Kam Snap kit, you get an awl or a poker, depending on what you want to call it. I like to put 4 snaps across the bottom. And again, I just do this by eyeball as far as spacing it. When I first started making these, I was measuring and getting it precise, and I found that it just took a lot of time for not a whole lot of value. Nobody's seeing this unless you're changing the diaper, and the main purpose is for it to be secure. So I just started going by eyeball. So I want to put 4 in. Again, you've got the front is on top and the back of the romper is on the bottom, and I just poke a hole all the way through both layers. This way I know that my snaps are going to line up well if I'm putting it through both layers at the same time. So that's my first one. I'm going to come over a little at the same level, and I'm going to poke my second hole. I kind of give it a little wiggle, pull it back and forth so the hole doesn't close up. Come over some more, put my third hole. Again, I work it a little bit to make the hole distinct, and then come over more. I don't think I did the greatest job in evenly spacing these out, but I think it's going to work. So when I unclip this, I can see how good of a job I did lining them up. I've got not too bad. This one came up a little bit higher. If that really bothered me, these holes kind of close up, I'm going to put plastic over it. I might poke a hole right underneath it. I'll show you. And the plastic's going to keep it from unraveling. So there we go. I just did another hole, and that's more in line. So how do these attach? I'm going to show you now, but I also have on my blog, lowcountrybliss.com, I have a tutorial for making the Taylor Romper. I have a tutorial for adding Kam Snaps, and I also have one for taking off and removing a Kam Snap. Sometimes when you're attaching it, you can crush it and it doesn't work well, and you need to be able to take it off. I have a tutorial for how to do that in an easy way. So the Kam Snap parts, you have a cap, you have the female end, and you have the male end. On the front, on the top, we're going to attach the female end. So you can think and remember it as F front, F female. So you want to give a think about how you're doing this so that you get them in the correct way so that they snap together. So you want the cap on the front because you know it's going to attach this way, and you want to see that smooth cap here, and then this part is going to be attaching to the male end. So I'm push this through, and I kind of use my fingernails, my thumbnails to push it in, and I take the female end and I sit it right in there. I've got my tool, my Kam Snap. I'm not sure what this is called. Not terribly expensive. I ordered it from the Kam Snap website, kamsnap.com, I believe. I'll put the information below in the description. But you're going to take and you're going to seat your cap into the disc portion of this black part of the tool and squeeze, and then just give it a good squeeze. And what that does is it flattens the prong and attaches the snap. I'm going to go ahead and do the corresponding one on the bottom, which is the back, and that's where the male snap is going to go. So I have my cap. Every time you attach half of the snap, you need a cap. So if I'm doing 4 snaps, I have 4 caps for the top and 4 of the female, and then I need 4 caps for the bottom and 4 of the male. So I know that it's going to attach this way, so I'm going to need the male end on this side, and I'm going to need the smooth cap on the inside on the lining. So I'm going to pop that through. Again, same deal. I'm going to kind of work it down with my thumbnails. I've just found that makes it go on a little easier, a little neater. And I've got the male end that has the protruding portion, and I'm going to sit that on top, push it in a little bit, and I'm just going to do a visual inspection. Is this how I want it to close? Especially when you first start using these, it'll save you from attaching them the wrong way to where you end up having to take them off. It's not difficult to take them off, but why make extra work for yourself, right? So I've got my clamp. There's an indentation in that black disc. That's what I'm going to rest the cap in. This is much easier if you're not trying to videotape this. I hope this is coming in picture. My video skills are not as strong as my sewing skills, but hopefully they'll grow with time. So I'm gonna put that in to the disc. And I'm gonna squeeze. You want to make sure you have careful placement so that you don't crack the snap, and then test it out. Did you hear that click? I have a really good connection. So it's going to be a good, strong snap. I'm using this quilting cotton, which is kind of a medium weight. My lining is also a cotton, and it's a little bit lighter than the main fabric, but only a tad lighter. So I don't feel the need to interface this, and it's been my experience that I can get a strong snap. So I'm going to go and I'm going to attach the rest of them, and I'll meet you back here. So that's the Taylor Romper by Children's Corner, my tried and true pattern for a baby gift. I love to sew this for a baby gift for several reasons. It's easy to sew. I usually have everything I need on hand. It's inexpensive, it's quick, but most of all, people really love receiving this gift. It makes me feel a little bit like a star when I am at the baby shower, and this is usually the most talked about gift. It's not all about the honor and acclaim for giving the best baby gift, but it does not hurt to know that you are making something that people really value and love. Leave in the comments below, what is your favorite tried and true gift? What is it that you like to sew for babies and children for gift? I'd like to know. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you later.